Hello and welcome back to our conversations with Isaiah. I'm the Reverend Nancy Springer, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, the Reverend David Matthews, as we continue walking through the book of Isaiah from beginning to end. We're more than halfway done. We are in chapter 41, remembering that the chapter and verse designations came long after the writer of this book put it all down in words. But it keeps us literally on the same page. So we will begin with chapter 41 in this conversation, reading from the Common English Bible.
Isaiah chapter 41. Be quiet before me, coastlands. Let the nations renew their strength. Let them approach and speak. Let's draw near for a judgment. Who has awakened one from the east and has authority to summon him to serve, giving him nations, conquering kings, making them like dust with his sword, like scattered straw with his bow? He pursues them and passes untouched, needing no path for his feet. Who has acted and who has done this, calling upon generation after generation since the beginning? I, the Lord, was first, and I will be the last. The coastlands see and fear, the ends of the earth tremble. They draw near and arrive. Each helps the other, each saying to the other, take courage. The craftsman encourages the metalworker. The one who smooths with the hammer encourages the one who strikes the anvil, saying of the welding, that's good, and strengthening it with nails so it won't move. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, offspring of Abraham, whom I love, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I chose you and didn't reject you. Don't fear, because I am with you. Don't be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will surely help you. I will uphold you with my righteous, strong hand. All who rage against you will be ashamed and disgraced. Those who contend with you will be as nothing and will perish. You will look for your opponents and won't find them. Those who fight you will be of no account and will die. I am the Lord your God, who grasps your strong hand, who says to you, don't fear, I will help you. Don't fear, worm of Jacob, people of Israel. I will help you, says the Lord. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. Look, I have made you into a new threshing tool with sharp teeth. You will thresh mountains and pulverize them. You will reduce hills to straw. When you winnow them, the wind will carry them off. The tempest will scatter them. You will rejoice in the Lord and take pride in the Holy One of Israel.
The poor and the needy seek water, and there is none. Their tongues are parched with thirst. I, the Lord, will respond to them. I, the God of Israel, won't abandon them. I will open streams on treeless hilltops and springs in valleys. I will make the desert into ponds and dry land into cascades of water. I will plant in the desert cedar, acacia, myrtle, and olive trees. I will put in the wilderness cypress, elm, and pine as well, so that they will see and know and observe and comprehend that the Lord's hand has done this, and the Holy One of Israel has created it. Present your case, says the Lord. Bring forward your evidence, says Jacob's King. Let the idols approach and tell us what will happen. The prior things, what are they? Announce them, and we'll think about them and know their significance. Or proclaim to us what is to come. Report things that will happen in the future, and then we'll know that you are gods. Do good or do bad. Then we will all be afraid and fearful. Look, you are nobody, and your deeds are nothing. Whoever chooses you is disgusting. I woke up from the north, and he came from the east, one who calls my name. He tramples governors like mud as the potter treads clay. Who announced this from the start so that we would know, from an earlier time so that we would say, that's right. Truly, no one announced it, no one proclaimed it, and no one heard your words. I first said it to Zion, look, here they are. To Jerusalem I now send a herald. But look, and there's no one among them, no counselor. But I look, and there's no one among them, no counselor. And when I ask, no one can answer. Look, all of them are frauds. Their deeds amount to nothing. Their images are a total delusion. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right. So David, let's just walk through this one. What jumps out at you? What is speaking to you today from these verses?
When we first look at the beginning chapter, it's obviously related to the previous one. The verses of the last chapter, Isaiah 40, are a declaration: youths will become tired and weary. Young men will certainly stumble, but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will fly up on wings like eagles. They will run and not be tired. They will walk and not be weary. And 40 is a contrast between these people of faith and those without, and the judgment that will obviously befall, but also the strength that will be given to those who trust. And 40 is really a building off of that idea. So we get right to the very beginning here, the declaration or the pronouncement: be quiet before me, coastlands. Let the nations renew their strength. Let them approach and speak. Let's draw near for a judgment. And so it really is all people coming to God, people of faith and people of not of faith, because that's what God has declared will happen. And to each will be given how they have responded to the call of God in their life, to the Spirit of God reaching out to them. And that's what we will, that's how our reception will be held, if you will, what will happen to us, how we are welcomed or not, as well as what will be our reward or not, will be based on that. So I find it very amazing that that's the first declaration, but then it goes on from the invitation of all people, or the declaration all people will come, because it's not an invitation that you can refuse. But then this next part, it says, who has awakened one from the east, who has authority to summon him to serve, giving him nations, conquering kings, making them like dust with his sword, scattered straw with his bow. And so this is like a question almost to the same extent in the book of Job, where he talks about God says to Job, where were you when I did, X, Y, and Z? And he talks about bridling Leviathan and the power of these great forces. And it's a similar idea here, is this declaration of God being God and we are not. And not just that we don't have the power, we don't have the wisdom or the insight, we don't have the goodness to stand in the place of God. And so it's this declaration of the greatness, the goodness, the authority of God. But then building off of that, it's God's declaration then, right? He pursues them and passed untouched, needing no path for his feet. Who has acted and who has done this, calling upon generation after generation since the beginning? And the answer is, I, the Lord, was first, and I will be the last. And of course, we as New Testament people, we hear this and are like, the book of Revelation, I read that. The Alpha and the Omega. I'm with you. I get you.
I get it. Yeah.
Yep. And so we hear in and through this the words of Jesus. And I find it very interesting, though, that this idea, right, verse 3, he who pursues them and passes untouched, needing no path for his feet. So I find it amazing because, of course, John the Baptist, right, from the verses, even just the chapter before, that are often associated with him, right, this idea of making straight, right, making straight the way for the Lord. And I just find it amazing because, of course, that's John's call. That's what John does. Yeah. But does God need you to make the path straight for him? No, he doesn't. He doesn't need that. But you're going to do it because that's what, like John the Baptist, that's who he was called to be. So that's what he did. Right. But God didn't need him to do it, And it's just a reminder that God doesn't need these things or anything really from us, but we do them because in doing them, we are partnering with him. We are being transformed into his likeness. We are being made like him. The job he has given us is not for his benefit. It's that by doing it, we are sanctified. We are transformed. Right. We are made into his being as we step into our created image, him. We are made to be more like him. We are made into who we were created to be. So it's just a fascinating idea here that these verses point those things out immediately.
Yeah, it is. And that God doesn't need us, but he chooses to work through our humanness, right? To bring about God's plan and God's way of doing things. And so and even the coastlands will see and the ends of the earth tremble, that all of creation is involved in it, right? And each helps the other, right? Each saying, take courage. And I love that the craftsman encourages the metal worker, and the one who smooths the hammer encourages the one who strikes the anvil, right? And so each of us is given something to do that's a part of the kingdom. And although, as you said, God can bring it all about without us, we each have a very necessary part, right? The craftsman and the metal worker, they're dependent on each other to do their job so that the other can do theirs. And that's the way God's kingdom is designed. God designs his kingdom to work, is that we are all a part, and we all have something to contribute for the benefit of others. That's why we do it.
And it's interesting because, again, it highlights this idea almost that there is and I'm always a bit tentative. I just want to sort of put that caveat in there that I'm always tentative with this, where this idea can ultimately take you. But God uses both those people who are, if you will, in the pro-God camp, or the I believe in God and I do everything I can, and I am a servant of God. God also uses the people who are, staunch atheists who, hear the name of God and spit on the ground and turn around 3 times, whatever. But God uses all in order in building up his kingdom, in continuing on the growth of his message in people's hearts and minds. And like, for example, the Babylonian kingdom and the armies, God used them to bring about judgment, and as well as the Assyrians. But then God turns around and brings judgment upon those through whom it happens. Similarly, Jesus talks about the idea of the person who will betray him. This is what's going to happen and what needs to happen, but woe to the one through whom it happens. Just because this is needed to happen doesn't mean you should want to be the one through whom this happens.
Right. Exactly. It's, God's glory, God being God, is not dependent on whether or not we believe in him. God is God, period. And we can choose to step into that likeness, live into the image in which we are created, and thrive and flourish as God intends for us to, or we can choose not to. And either choice, God's plan is still going to be God's plan. It's still going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a number of pop culture movies out there, and there's one called Rise of the Guardians, in which you have these almost mythic figures like Santa Claus and whatever else, and they have power only in so much as people believe in them. And it's an important distinction that God doesn't have power just because we believe in God. Right. At the end of the day, if every single person in the world stopped believing in God, if everybody stopped believing in, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we all turned our worship to some other invented God, then that doesn't mean the true God ceases to exist. If I believe false things, and I'm sure there are areas of my theology in which God looks at me and goes, yeah, we need to talk about that someday. There are just because there are areas of error and areas of ignorance doesn't mean God stops being true or God stops being
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we need to remember that as people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Kind of puts our ego in the right place to remember
Absolutely. And you and I have talked before about, denominationalism and, that the picture of the person in his class and
that.
sort of shows the tree of all the denominations breaking apart and circling it, being like, and here's where we got it right. It's like,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
that's not how it works.
Right. Right.
We are all faithfully attempting just to be able to answer the questions of life around us, and being able to, with conviction and a searching heart, be able to find God.
Right. Exactly.
So
Well said.
as we attempt in continue on in that journey, God continues to encourage us, though. So Nancy, as we get to verse 8, and we're moving along here, what stands out to you? What speaks to you?
Well, in this next bit, right, it's just further assurance of God's presence with us and God's help in all things, right? What that God will strengthen us, and he assures us of his assurance, right? With the echoes of the exodus of Egypt in those, you will look for your opponents and won't find them, and those who fight you will be of no account. I, the Lord your God, who grasps your strong hand, who says to you, don't fear, I will help you. Don't fear. And so, all the times throughout history, from the Exodus from Egypt, that's hard to say, that God was there even when it didn't seem like there was any hope. And so it's just that further assurance through this section here that God will be there.
Absolutely, and then building off the last chapter, right? The young will renew their strength, rise up on wings like eagles. All of these things are built off and predicated on this foundational truth: I am the Lord your God. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. Like, the do not fear and the do not be dismayed are because of the truth: I am your God. And if I am your God, then you don't need to fear. You don't need to be dismayed. Why? Because God's promise to you is, I will surely help you. I will uphold you. And so this declaration by God to the people has so many rippling effects. And this is what the people are called to see in this, that Isaiah is trying to help them to see in this moment. If God, then consequentially, these things are true and these things will happen. God will bring about his plan.
Right. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, right? That through our journey of life, our walking with God, our seeking to be who God calls us to be, we are made more like God. The more we seek God, the more we are made more Christ-like, to put it in a New Testament phrase. This was verse 16, right? When you winnow them, the wind will carry them off and the tempest will scatter them. 2 Sundays ago in the lectionary, his winnowing fork is in his hand, right? And he waits, right? And so, there's not a lot of farmers in my congregation, so I did some research on what winnowing truly was. And it's not separating the good grain from the bad grain. It's taking away those things that keep the grain from being truly what that piece of grain was supposed to be, either to make food or to plant a new seed, right? It's the purifying, the sanctification of that grain. It's removing of the husk, so that the grain can be what it was created to be. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's right. So when I read through this, getting ready for this conversation, I thought, oh, okay, so right, the winnowing is still a part of it. Even, and it just goes back to say, even people that don't profess belief in God, God is still using them and working through them in some way. And so that just really, as we see Isaiah through the eyes of John the Baptizer and vice versa, right, in this season that we are reading through the lectionary, that it's, I just love the parallels. So anyway, the winnowing piece was really interesting to me in this one, that it's just getting us ready so that we can rejoice in the Lord and take pride in the Holy One of Israel, so that we can be who it is God created us to be.
And it's interesting because when we come to next section, verse 17, it says, the poor and the needy seek water and there is none. Their tongues are parched with thirst. I, the Lord, will respond to them. I, the God of Israel, won't abandon them. And it's an interesting note, because the recognition, look, there are poor and needy people. And the recognition is, of course, whenever there is a crisis or a problem, who are the people that are most affected? Well, they are the poor and the needy. They are the people who don't have the power to be able to fend for themselves or to be able to pay for other people to help them.
Right.
And so God is saying, look, these people who are poor, just because they are poor doesn't mean they're less valued by me. And that's an interesting statement there, because it seems that in this, by God's declaration of I won't abandon them, that once again gets to this idea of value, of human value. God doesn't see the rich person as more valuable than the poor person. So the rich person, even if the rich person was, able to become rich, not because of some unfair scales, or they didn't need to be corrupt necessarily, and they didn't necessarily need to steal from somebody else, and they didn't necessarily even need to start life with a certain degree of privilege or anything like that. Maybe actually they worked for everything and they made it, and they truly made it. But even that person, God does not look at and be like, yes, you're more valuable. No, to God looks at both people and says, I created you. You are made in my image. I built you. And so in that, like this whole section just reminds us of that, and God's personal care for these people as well.
Right. And it reflects forward, if you can do that, right? The poor and needy seek water and there is none. And how does Jesus describe himself but as the living water, right? Whoever comes to me will never be thirsty. And so it's, right, it is the life that God intends for us to be when we give credit to God, right? It's that whole series of I statements. I, the Lord, I will open, I will make, I will plant, right? So that everyone will see and observe and comprehend that it is God who has done
this. This is all pointing at the idea, or for the proclamation of God's identity, for the evangelism, if you will. Forgive the use of the word there if you don't like it, but it's for the evangelism of the nations, of all people.
Right. It's the same reason that God did the plagues in Egypt, right? So that Pharaoh will know, so that everyone will know that I am God.
Yeah, and it's important to note in that God heals, God blesses, God transforms, all for the purpose that people might know who he is and might choose him and therefore find true life in him. God is not blessing you so that you might hoard the blessing or that you might then understand your true value. No, it's that all people would understand God's value. So a reminder to us, when God does do these things in our life in answer to prayer, these messages and stories aren't meant to be kept to ourselves, but something to be shared.
To be proclaimed. I've been reading a really good book called Unfettered by a woman named Mandy Smith, and she talks about this being one of the biggest challenges to those of us in Western influence, Western world influence Christianity, that right, our culture says it is our self-sufficiency that's going to save the world. And there is nothing in scripture that supports that, right? It is God's power, God's strength, God's doing through us. Yes, absolutely. God chooses to use us, but it is not our self-sufficiency that's going to save the world. It is God and God alone that saves the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So Nancy, we come to verses 21. Our heading in the version we're reading, it says, other gods challenged. And so we get a sense as we've read this, that God is, that Isaiah has so far talked about the nations and all people coming and having to identify or recognize who God is. We have recognized that the people who do follow God do have this blessing or this promise of God being with them through to the end. But now we come to this section, and specifically starting at verse 21 onward, we do have this bringing up of idols, of other gods. What do you make of this?
Well, I think we talked about this in one of the last few sessions, right? About how it's easy for us in 21st century North America to go, oh, we don't have idols. We don't have little statues sitting in our house that we worship. But we have lots of other idols, right? Our own success, our own abilities become our idols when we give all of our energy towards being the best at something, right? Instead of just doing our best and being the best that God calls us to be the best, right? Then that becomes that successful ranking in whatever field can become our idol, because we live for that title rather than living for the glory of God. And so we have to really look at what our current modern day idols are. You talked about our TV screens and our iPads and all that being the thing we worship in our homes, because our entire rooms are arranged to stare at this thing in front of us, as if it were a little statue of a man-made God set up there. But it's right, the falseness of these idols is what God talks through, again, hearkening back to Job. Where were you when I did this, right? So, God says to the idols, come on, proclaim the future. Tell us what's going to happen. Let's see how that works out for you.
Mm-hmm. So we come to we go through this section looking at idols, and we come to this last line of the chapter. Look, all of them are frauds. Their deeds mount to nothing. Their images are a total delusion. And just that, the last two words, total delusion. I find it fascinating because some of these forces, some of these things in existence that we can turn our attention to and worship, they have power, right? They have strength. I can look at any one of these, magnificent self-help books in the world, and by following their advice, I really can, be a better me in some ways, depending, of course, on how I define better me. But equally, there are a lot of things in which we can turn our attention to, sort of this idea of making myself into a better me. And I can become more diligent, and I can become kinder and more thoughtful by turning my attention, if you will, in my worship to, well, myself or to these other things. I can become better. But I would almost state, just, talks about them becoming total, because of this, the images are total delusion, that some of these betterments of myself are lucky happenstance. They happen to be on the way to, these things are good, but they're on the way towards this delusion or through this delusion. But me becoming better isn't because of them. Rather, the vision of following these idols doesn't make it actually true. It just again, lucky happenstance that that I happen to go along the way. It's the reason why people have bought into this lie in the first place. But God himself, in following in God's ways, is the actual roadmap that gets us to these places in truth. And it is what is objectively true, not just, old wives' tales kind of ideas.
Right. So their image, the idol's image, whatever that image is we are seeking to achieve falsely, right, is the delusion. But when we seek to live into the image of God in which we are all created, that is the reality we were created for, the true image. Seeking to follow Jesus and to learn to be more and more like him every day. And that makes us, equips us, and transforms us into the best people we can be, being the best of who God created us to be.
Mm-hmm. And it's us manifesting that created image, us being transformed into it. And this is all through the power of the Holy Spirit, through the power of God, us cooperating with our created purpose. So that's what this really comes back to, is that God is God, we are not. God is objectively true, whether we choose to believe in him or not. God is, there is a difference between following him or not. And God does empower us and is with us when we do call on his name, when we do identify ourselves and do walk in his ways. I am with you. I will strengthen you and uphold you. I will, do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, uphold you. I'll uphold you with my righteous right hand. All of this idea, God continues to work in and through towards this ultimate purpose of reuniting yourself with him, but also the entire world with him as well.
Right, because we are all, every human being, right, is a beloved child of God, and it is God's greatest desire to be with us and to be in relationship with us. I mean, that's sending Jesus as a baby, right? Christmas that is coming up that we celebrate, right? Emmanuel, God come to us, to be with us, so that we can flourish and thrive as God created us to, and live into that image of being his beloved children.
Absolutely. So Nancy, is there anything else that you would want to highlight or touch on before we sum up today?
I think that's about it. Yeah, we'll continue on next time as we roll into the next chapter 42, which will continue this conversation. But yeah, this was about all I've got. What about you?
No, I think that sums it up quite nicely. And so we'll continue on with chapter 42 next time.
All right, thanks.
God bless.
Bye.